Where is God when it hurts? There was a survey done by George Barna where he asked this question: if you could ask God anything and he had to answer, what would it be? The overwhelming majority response was, why is there pain and suffering in the world? Why do bad things happen to good people like me, like you? Trials, tribulations, suffering. How do you cope? We're going to read in 1 Peter chapter 4 about some Christians who were suffering. Look in verse 12. He says, dear friends. In the Greek it reads, beloved. I like that. He reminds them, you are loved. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. Let's talk about the do's and don'ts of suffering. Here's a don't. Don't be surprised. He says, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come upon you. It's interesting that he calls it a fiery ordeal. Peter wrote this letter somewhere around 64 AD. You might know that that's the same time that the Roman Emperor Nero saw the city of Rome burn. It burned for 9 weeks. When he saw it burning, he was gleeful. Why? Because he wanted to build in place of all of the old part of the city that was now gone. But people lost loved ones, people lost property, and they started to blame Nero. So he needed a scapegoat. He needed to blame someone, so he decided to blame the Christians. In fact, to make a statement, he put Christians on poles, covered them with pitch, set them on fire as human torches to light his garden. And so when Peter says, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that comes upon you, they can picture that. This began 200 years of intense persecution against the church. And so it was commonplace to suffer. It was not unusual. And even today in the year 2020, we don't suffer like that. But we don't need to be surprised when trials come. On this side of heaven, we will suffer. We will experience pain. So don't be surprised. Keep reading. Verse 13, but rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ. So here's a do. Do rejoice. Are you telling me that I should rejoice in my trials? Well, yes. And part of the reason we can say that is what it says next. Inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ. Why should we expect the world to treat us any differently than it treated Jesus? The world persecuted Jesus and the world will persecute us. But it's okay. I can rejoice because my joy is focused on the presence of Christ in my life, not the absence of problems. Most people, if you ask them what they want in life, they'll say, I just want to be happy. Just want to be happy. But happiness depends on happenings. If good things happen, then you're happy. If bad things happen, then you're sad. Joy is different than happiness. Joy is deeper. It's an inside job. I can be joyful in spite of what's happening in my life because my joy rests in my relationship with Jesus Christ. So do rejoice. Let's keep reading. Verse 15, if you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or a thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. One translation says busybody. I laughed out loud. In the same verse that talks about murderers and thieves, he mentions a busybody. Sometimes I think they do just as much damage. He says, if you suffer, don't suffer by committing one of these sins. Keep reading verse 16. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. Do's and don'ts. Don't be surprised. Do rejoice. Here's a third one. Do be selective. If you're going to suffer, don't suffer for sin. Suffer for doing what is right. He says suffer as a Christian. The Bible, in the Bible, you only see the word Christian 3 times. That's not what they called themselves. They called themselves believers, but It was their enemies who would call them Christians. It was a derogatory term. In the day, Caesarianos is what they would call someone who worshiped Caesar. They would say Caesar is Lord. But a Christian refused to say Caesar is Lord, so they started calling Christians Christianos, or those who worship Christ. And after a while, the believers thought, okay, I'm all right with being called a Christianos, a Christian, because that is what I do. I worship Christ. Only Jesus is Lord. So be selective. If you suffer for the right reason. And finally, one do's and don'ts. Here's the last do. Do have an eternal perspective. I see that up in verse 13 where he says, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. Well, what's he talking about? Jesus is glorified in heaven right now, but his glory has not yet been revealed. This is going to happen at the second coming. Jesus will come again. So I think what he's trying to tell us is, yes, you're suffering right now, but you will not suffer forever. Your suffering is temporary, but you are eternal. Jesus is coming again. So we need to have an eternal perspective. And when your world feels like it's falling apart, that's okay. I'm not going to fall apart because I know that my God is bigger than my trial. He's bigger than my pain. He's bigger than the sickness. He's bigger than the adversity. He's bigger than the biggest thing that you might be facing right now. God is still on his throne. He's still in control. And one day, he is coming back again. He is God when things are good, and he's God when things are bad. He's God when things are great, and he's God when I don't understand what's happening. I'm okay either way because my joy is found in my God who one day promises to come again. Suffering, it's bad. I get that, but it's temporary. You, on the other hand, are eternal. Have a great day.